Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and joining me once again to talk breakout wide receivers, PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nathan Jahnke. Nate, how are you today?
I am doing well. I would be doing a little bit better if there weren't so many wide receivers getting injured today. We had Josh Downs earlier this morning, and right before we hit record, Rondale Moore carted off the field. So hopefully both of those wide receivers end up okay, and they can maybe be breakout receivers this season, but we won't be talking about either of them this episode.
Yeah, luckily it wasn't anybody that we're going to talk about today that, kind of completely derails the episode. But yeah, still don't like to see these injuries in general happening already before we get to see any real snaps played. So yeah, we got preseason coming up. Obviously, that's the exciting thing. The Hall of Fame game is now behind us. So we can, kind of look into some maybe more actionable information to take from those games, I would hope, and get us prepped for our fantasy drafts and the rest of this offseason. But in the meantime, we're going to continue covering some of the key discussions to help kind of do the same thing in getting people ready for their fantasy drafts. And today, that means breakout wide receivers, Nate. So we've covered breakout running backs last week. We did breakout quarterbacks a couple weeks before that. So this week, we're going to turn our attention to the other most exciting position for fantasy, the wide receivers. And same kind of criteria, I guess, that we had, when we discussed the breakout running backs. We were looking for players that haven't finished as, top 12 at their position or like a high-end RB2 or wide receiver 2 in this case, either in points per game or overall finish. And we're expecting kind of a nice increase in production from those previous seasons as well. So should be fun. I love talking breakouts, and we'll get into that here in just a second. But I do want to remind everyone to head to PFF.com if you want to dominate your fantasy league this season with PFF. Use code FANTASY25 to get 25% off your PFF Plus annual subscription. You can gain access to our fantasy mock draft simulator, draft rankings, and live draft assistant. It'll allow you to use in-season tools like My Team Dashboard for start-sit decisions. We got matchup charts and more, so you can stay on top of your roster all season long, and featuring weekly waiver wire targets as well, buy low, sell high advice, rest of season rankings, and more. So again, go to subscribe.pff.com and use code FANTASY25 at checkout, or click the link in the episode description. All right, Nate, let's get into our breakout wide receivers now. We've both written up our breakout wide receiver articles for PFF.com by this point, so people can check those out now as well. And we'll start this episode off with one of your picks here from the Kansas City Chiefs, Rashee Rice.
Oh, yeah, Rice is someone that at the end of last season, when we were doing our fun drafts at the end of episodes, talked about Rice as a potential top 5 wide receiver, top 12 player, all before he ran into his legal situations. So before that, we were thinking very highly of him. He was playing well throughout the season on small sample sizes, talking about him basically every week on our recap episode because the Kansas City wide receivers were constantly changing what they were doing. But by the end of last season, he had a very consistent role in the offense. He was playing at least 75% of offensive snaps over the last 4 weeks of the regular season, as well as the last 4 weeks of the playoffs. Did that in 7 of those 8 games. So he had a consistent large role during that time. Was wide receiver 8 over those last 4 weeks of the regular season, averaging 65 yards, 6 receptions throughout the playoffs against some fairly good defenses. So he looked excellent, and his role is also pretty unique. Was typically the X receiver in 2 receiver sets, moved to the slot in 3 receiver sets. That's something that is not very common in the NFL. CeeDee Lamb does it, the top wide receiver in fantasy football. We've seen Keenan Allen at times do it in his career. Adam Thielen, when he was closer to his peak, do it. So we don't see it that often, but when that does happen, that is the best role a wide receiver can have for fantasy football, just looking at their past performances. So that's been good for him. I think the big thing is they added Hollywood Brown, they added Xavier Worthy, but both of them are more deep threats, where Rice was very much a low average depth of target player. So I'm not too concerned about the new wide receiver additions for him. The big thing is if he does get suspended, and we don't know if he'll get suspended, but basically every day that goes by that we don't get more news on this, the less likely it is that he's going to be suspended at some point this season. So I think the closer we get to draft time, the more his ADP is going to keep rising and rising, as long as we don't get any more news of his legal situation. But I think he is very much capable of being at least a top 20 wide receiver, as long as he's playing in games in this Kansas City offense. So I'm excited about what he can do in his second season.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. Like, I think one of the best things about drafting Rice right now is that his ADP, like, it's dropped significantly post NFL draft, right? And with news of that those off field incidents and concerns of the possible suspension. But I was looking on Underdog. He was being drafted as the wide receiver 23, I believe, on like April 5th or something prior to that first incident. He's since fallen to wide receiver 34 on Underdog, and he's still like wide receiver 49 on Sleeper, where maybe drafters haven't yet caught up to the situation. And that, like you said, as we get closer to the season, it kind of looks like it's improving, or at least the chances of him not being suspended are improving. So I think that plays a big part of it. And now, like, I was kind of looking at, what are the chances of him getting suspended before the season or during the season? And I'm no lawyer, obviously, but the one, bigger kind of personal conduct suspension from this offseason was Steelers cornerback Cameron Sutton, who was suspended 8 games. It was a domestic violence incident. But the difference being there was a resolution on that case, I think, back in April, and it took about 3 months for the NFL to hand that suspension out. So far, there hasn't really been any resolution on Rice's legal situation from what I've seen, which to me feels like we could be looking at next year for his suspension. And it does sound like it could be around 8 games as well. I'm not sure, but I guess I'd be pretty surprised if they dropped like an 8-game suspension on the guy mid-season. But you never know. It's not impossible, but that's, just me kind of reading the tea leaves there. I'm sure there's someone a lot smarter than me who's more knowledgeable about that stuff that can speak to it better. But right now, like, I mean, one of the best things about Rice, like you said, with everything that he did last year and his fit in that offense is his cost in drafts. And I think he's probably one of the best values to kind of take advantage of right now too. And on top of being a breakout candidate in a full-time role for an entire season. So feeling pretty excited about him. If he gets suspended, obviously that can hurt us. But I think the cost is more than worth the risk there.
Yeah, and like the risk is there, but you are drafting plenty of wide receivers on your team, and there are plenty of good wide receivers out there. Like, we're going to be talking about several guys where hopefully they break out, but even if they don't break out, they're still going to put up some decent numbers this season, and you're going to be drafting multiple of those players. So if Rice does get suspended, you should have good options on your roster to take that place, which is why it's okay to take a lot of risk at wide receivers, as long as you get one of these top guys and then get another player that's a little safer or two that's a veteran. Then you're free to take as many risks as you want throughout the rest of the draft at wide receiver.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right, let's talk about another bigger name here with potential breakout potential in 2024, and one that feels pretty obvious, but it also felt obvious last year when I had him on my breakout list and it didn't happen. So I'm doubling down on Atlanta Falcons wide receiver Drake London. And kind of the huge difference between last year and this year, obviously, is Kirk Cousins signing with the team. That just makes every Falcons offensive piece much more valuable for fantasy than than the quarterback situation previously, because there's just so much importance in a quarterback who can accurately and consistently get the ball to his top playmakers. Obviously, it's crucial for the fantasy success of those players on the other side of the ball as well, with quarterbacks and wide receiver play being tied so closely together. And I don't think anybody felt that effect maybe more than Drake London had over the past 2 seasons. And, you look at him in 2022, he ranked outside the top 100 qualifying wide receivers in catchable pass rate. And that did improve in 2023. He moved to 68th, but the Falcons offense somehow got worse, right? They ranked 27th in touchdown drive percentage. They ranked 26th in overall scoring percentage. And then you look at London specifically among wide receivers with at least 100 targets. He was by far the lowest fantasy finish of the bunch as the PPR wide receiver 38. So getting a new quarterback paired with a new coaching staff, to me, is like a perfect kind of recipe to allow that breakout potential to come to fruition for London. And the offense is another part of that for sure, right? Because the addition of Kirk Cousins and the subtraction of Arthur Smith as head coach, like the Falcons seemingly fixed two of the issues that kind of held back the stars of that offense in 2023 and a little bit before that too, right? So if you look at Raheem Morris and maybe specifically offensive coordinator Zach Robinson, former PFFer, hello, can find the success, if they could find the success that they had with the Rams over the past two seasons, then that could be one of the biggest keys as well, right? So you look at the Rams in 2023 with Zach Robinson, involved there. They were top 10 in touchdown drive percentage, as well as overall scoring percentage, top 10 in offensive points scored, and successful play percentage, all areas where the Falcons were well below average in that regard. So obviously, the Rams have a nice offense, but the personnel's in place there for Atlanta as well to kind of deliver on that level of success, especially if Kirk Cousins is healthy. And that's one of the most important things. Obviously, we don't know what he's going to look like coming off the Achilles injury, but if he's healthy, I mean, we're talking about one of the most accurate quarterbacks in recent seasons. He's ranked 6th over the past 2 years in adjusted completion rate. He ranks 11th in passing grade and 8th in PFF wins above replacement. So that's just a huge upgrade for Drake London and all of the Falcons offense. And for London specifically, a guy that's ranked 15th in PFF receiving grades since entering the league, but he ranks just outside 26th at the position in receiving yards, and he's tied for 24th in reception. So he's never finished as a top 24 PPR wide receiver. He's being drafted inside the top 12 right now. Obviously, Kirk Cousins being healthy is important, but I think there's absolutely reason to believe that he has that potential this season.
Yeah, agreed. Definitely excited about him. Pretty much the same reasons. It's because they have Kirk Cousins now and because they no longer have Arthur Smith. Just looking at it from a little different perspective of how to look at some of these numbers, the Falcons, they were very bad at quarterback last season, a team grade of 49.4 passing. Even if you compare that to Cousins' worst season in the last 6 seasons, he had a 76.1 passing grade. So that's a huge difference in passing grade, one that we very rarely see from one year to another from a team, if we're assuming Cousins will be like at his worst from recent memory. I've tried to find, there were 4 other situations in the PFF era where we have that kind of extreme grade shift from one season to another. The Cardinals going from Drew Stanton to Carson Palmer. That turned Larry Fitzgerald from wide receiver 51 to wide receiver 7. The Colts, this happened twice. First going from 40-year-old Matt Hasselbeck to Andrew Luck, then going from Jacoby Brissett when Andrew Luck was injured back to Andrew Luck. Both times T.Y. Hilton went from wide receiver 20s to wide receiver 5 one season, wide receiver 16 the other season. And then the other example, Josh Allen making that massive leap from 2019 to 2020. And then Stephon Diggs, first year with the team, was wide receiver 3 that season. So we've seen these massive improvements, but they were all to veteran wide receivers that have more of a track record than London. So this is a pretty unique situation where we see a young wide receiver who has played well on 2 seasons, was drafted very highly, seeing this improvement at quarterback. And we're seeing pretty much the same thing with the Jets, with going to Aaron Rodgers this season, and what we expect Rodgers to do with Garrett Wilson being a similar wide receiver drafted highly that's played very well with bad quarterback play. So both of them, it's a bit of a projection of how much higher they can be this season. But the information that we have so far looks like he should be able to do it. And then losing Arthur Smith, he was only running 27 routes per game. The Falcons were so incredibly run heavy that even though London was often on the field, he still wasn't running nearly as many routes as a bunch of other wide receivers. And he also had some bad touchdown luck in there as well. He was targeted a decent amount when they were close to scoring, but a couple of times he was tackled just short of the goal line. So all it takes is those plays to end up slightly differently, and London's fantasy value last year would have looked a bit better. And also just noting that they very rarely threw to wide receivers last season, a 41.5% target rate to the wide receivers, which is pretty unheard of, which a lot of that had more to do with all the other wide receivers in Atlanta. But if Zach Robinson is similar to the other coaches in Los Angeles, they were throwing 72.6% to wide receivers, which is one of the higher rates in the league. So expect London to get a lot better targets and a lot better quarterback play. So that should add up to a lot better season. But this is a lot of new moving parts that have to go right in order for that to happen.
It is, right? But I mean, they're all such important parts, and they look to be in a good spot right now, especially again, quarterback being the biggest one. And then again, like you said, that offensive shift in philosophy and usage and everything like that is such a big part of it. It's the same thing with Kyle Pitts, right? People getting upset that fantasy analysts are back on Kyle Pitts, even though they've been burned before. I mean, it's such a different situation this year that you can't really look at years past and compare apples to apples here, because it's not the same. So yeah, I'm very excited about London, very excited about Kyle Pitts, and I hope the Atlanta Falcons have a nice season here under Kirk Cousins. But how about a player that we're both really excited about, it seems, for this year? We both had him in our breakout articles, Jaxon Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. Nate, why don't you start us off here on JSN's breakout potential?
Yeah, we kind of went through and I systematically looked at all the players who we could consider for this podcast. And a lot of them are either second-year receivers or third-year receivers. But out of the second-year receivers, I think he has the potential to do better. He had a pretty slow start to the season, and then he was just consistently gaining around 50 to 60 receiving yards each week, never really having that big game to help bump his fantasy stats. For me, a big thing will be his role. Probably one of the biggest things I'm looking for this preseason is what his role ends up being. But he was pretty unique for a slot receiver. He had a high yards per route run whenever he lined up out wide, when he was facing press coverage, when he was facing man coverage. Those are things that you often think of with the bigger X receivers for teams, not so much the slot receivers. So if he can do better at the things we expect slot receivers to do, that'll be huge. And then just Ryan Grubb, I think, will be huge for this offense in general. The Seahawks were running the fewest offensive plays last season, have been pretty consistently near the bottom of the league in those metrics. Expect that to change and expect them to be even more pass heavy. So that'll help everyone in the offense. And then the big thing is just what his role in the offense is going to be. Last year, he was the primary slot receiver, wasn't even the primary backup in two receiver sets. It was Jake Bobo who got the third most snaps in that situation. And even looking at Grubb's offense last year, was two clear outside receivers, Dunze and Polk on the outside, McMillan as the slot receiver, and McMillan was rarely playing in those two receiver sets and was the third targeted of the bunch. So if he remains the slot receiver all season and not playing in those two wide receiver sets, then I'm probably not as excited about him. But we have Tyler Lockett, who is nearing the end of his career. He's already kind of infamous for falling down on plays to avoid contact to prolong his career. So I would think he'd be okay with not having as many snaps, and Smith-Njigba taking some of those snaps in two receiver sets. And another thing you can do to prolong your career is just not seeing as many snaps each game. So if Smith-Njigba can start playing in those two wide receiver sets, I'll be really excited for him. But if we go through this preseason, I have no idea what Grubb's philosophy will be in the preseason, if he's going to play the starters, rest of the starters, since you see some consistency for offensive play callers one year to another. But he's new to the NFL, so we'll see there. But if we see him playing in two wide receiver sets, the second he plays in one of them, if I'm doing the live snap counts for that game, I will tweet about it after that single snap. But that's one of the probably biggest things I'll be looking for this preseason, is him and some of these other slot receivers that we're excited for this year to see if they are playing at all in two wide receiver sets.
Yeah, it's so important, right? And for him last year too, we know that he's a versatile talent and he could do a lot more than kind of how he was being used last year, which I found a little bit frustrating, kind of watching him last season. He was very much designated to kind of this low ADOT type of usage, and again, just limited to that slot role. But he saw 90 targets across 17 games, but he had the sixth lowest average depth of target in the league at 6.4 yards. And then, it just kept everything else down, right? His yards per route run, 1.32, that ranked outside the top 50 at his position. Total receiving yards, 628, also outside the top 50. It just kind of puts a cap on what his potential could be in that low A dot slot only kind of role. And again, if you look back at his kind of Ohio State profile and his college profile, like he was a draft prospect that ranked 99th percentile since 2019 in separation rate on throws 10 plus yards downfield at 53%, right? So he can be more than that, low A dot type guy. He could play downfield and do more there. And then he posted a 96th percentile career yards per route run at 3.32 at Ohio State as well. So I think you factor in some of the success and college profile for him, and that helps kind of feel a little bit better than what we just got from him in year one, even though I think it was good. But I think there's definitely a lot more meat on the bone there with JSN here in year two. And hopefully Ryan Grubb can help unlock that, because there's going to be a part of him that he has to kind of push Tyler Lockett for that wide receiver 2 role, right? We did see Lockett's production drop off, I think, quite a bit last year in what was like year 9 of his career, I believe. So he posted the lowest yardage total of his career since 2017, despite playing all 17 games. His yards per route run was the lowest since 2017. So now he's going into year 10 here, 32 years old. Like you said, I think there's definitely a reason for them to kind of factor in more JSN and less Tyler Lockett this season. But it's going to be up to the coaching staff. We'll see. Hopefully we get some of those hints and usage in the preseason. We just don't know, but I will have to have Nate's notifications on to follow that for sure. But staying on the field is going to be the biggest thing. And again, being, continuing as that kind of pass heavy offense, which they were last year, but like you said, they were just not running nearly as many plays. So there wasn't a ton to benefit from there, but just utilizing JSN in more of a versatile role than what he was last year as more of an all around kind of wide receiver, I think just makes a huge difference in what he can do this year compared to last year.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I think he'll be better this season, even if he doesn't have that bigger role. But if he does get that bigger role, that's where he really becomes a breakout, where he has that like top 20 wide receiver potential rather than just being a borderline fantasy starter.
Absolutely. All right. How about one of my other favorite breakout wide receivers this year, maybe going a bit deeper into the ADP now, but still one that I like quite a bit. It's Rashid Shaheed of the New Orleans Saints. So Shaheed has kind of become known as more of a deep threat in the NFL. And for the most part last year and as a rookie, that's what he was. In 2023, though, he ranked 15th among wide receivers in average depth of target. He ranked tied for 21st in the NFL last year in 20-plus yard targets, and then tied for 64th in targets below the 20-yard threshold. So, kind of like what we were saying with Jaxon Smith-Njigba, the potential, I think, for Shaheed to be utilized as more of an all-around wide receiver with a bigger role in 2024 is kind of what makes him at least a breakout candidate for me. And then, kind of considering the Saints' lack of depth outside of Chris Olave at the position, it feels like he is the likely wide receiver 2 in this offense, a role that Michael Thomas had when he was healthy last year. But I think it gives him a great shot to kind of exceed his career high 71 targets and all the receiving production that comes along with it. But we did get a glimpse last year of Shaheed being more than just a deep threat as the team's wide receiver 2 when Michael Thomas was out of the lineup after week 10. Shaheed went from 36% of his total targets being 20-plus yards downfield with Thomas in the lineup to just 17% of his targets being deep throws with Thomas out of the lineup. There's an argument to be made that the shorter throws are less valuable for fantasy, but they're also higher percentage completions to help with his PPR value as well. And it's not even to say that the deep throws are going away either. We're just expecting more to be added to Shaheed's plate this year. And, if we look at who's passing him the ball, Derek Carr ranked 10th last season in adjusted completion rate on throws less than 20 yards downfield at 81.9%, but he ranked 16th in adjusted completion rate on throws 20 plus yards downfield at 43%. And again, we saw it more last year as well with Shaheed when he was further integrated into the offense there with Michael Thomas out. Those higher percentage throws started to pay off for him. He increased his yards per route run from to 5.50, up from 4.50, and yards per reception 8.5, up from 6.4 on throws less than 20 yards downfield. So he could definitely do it. There's signs of it. It's just kind of flashes and glimpses. It's not a full season or anything like that, but just kind of projecting for 2024 and what his role can be. I think he's definitely capable of kind of being more than just a deep threat in this offense. So how about you? What are your thoughts on Shaheed here heading into this season?
Yeah, I'm definitely intrigued to see what he can do. I think, like you said, he was known as a deep threat. He had the 10th most deep receptions last year, and I don't think his ADOT even does him justice for how much he was a deep threat, because he was also at the 38th most target or receptions behind the line of scrimmage, because they were using him on screen passes and just trying to get him in that space and use him how he's used as a returner and just see what he can do there. So in the short and intermediate, he had 25 receptions, which was 74th among wide receivers last season. So there was a huge difference between where he was seeing his receptions compared to most receivers. So like you said, we're not expecting those things to go away. We just want to see more of those short and intermediate passes, because if he can do those at a high level, then he's going to be a very well-rounded wide receiver. And he's definitely like defaulted as the number 2 player. The other options, A.T. Perry, Bub Means, late round draft pick wide receiver for them. Cedric Wilson, who was buried on the Dolphins depth chart these last couple seasons. Quantimus St. Brown, similarly on the Bears wide receiver team, and like battle down that depth chart when they didn't have much depth at wide receiver to begin with either. So there's really no other option to be that number 2 wide receiver. And it's worth noting that they've changed offensive coordinators as well. Clint Kubiak's now the offensive coordinator. They were on a team that liked to rotate players in and out a ton. That even included Chris Olave getting rotated out more than you would expect from a number 1 wide receiver. So Shaheed should see a significant increase in playing time, still be able to make those deep plays. It's just a matter of how high his target share can get, doing all of those other things that he just doesn't have the experience with. So that'll be a thing. I know he's also being that kind of speedster, a little more susceptible to injury. I know he's dealing with a little something now that's not expected to be long-term, but that's also a general concern with him. But when you're drafting him to be a backup wide receiver, that's a breakout with high upside. You can live with some of that injury risk, but it's at least worth monitoring. And then also worth checking your league scoring system, because if you get points for return yards, he's someone who could get a lot of it. I know he didn't see quite as many returns once he became a starter last season, but it's possible he goes back to the returner, especially with these kickoff return rules. So worth keeping an eye on there, and keeping an eye on your league settings, because that could be a huge part of his play as well.
Yeah. I just love that he doesn't have that other competition outside of Olave. Obviously, like Alvin Kamara is probably, his greatest competition for receiving targets, but they don't even play the same position, right? So it's not the same as having another wide receiver in that role. So yeah, I was looking too, like with Thomas out of the lineup in 2023, Shaheed's target rate improved as well, went up to 19.4%, which was up from 15.3%. And that ranks second among the team's wide receivers, behind only Olave as well, obviously. So yeah, feeling pretty good about him in his chances of kind of having his best season yet here in New Orleans. But Nate, let's talk about the Bills wide receiver room now, because we both quite like a couple names in that offense, which is, unsurprising considering that their top 2 wide receivers from last year, Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis, are no longer in the picture. So plenty of meat on the bone here in a Josh Allen offense. So who is the wide receiver that you're most interested in for the Buffalo Bills?
So I'm going to go with Curtis Samuel. Looking at his situation in the past, he has had not great quarterback play throughout his career. Cam Newton at the end of his career with Carolina, then Teddy Bridgewater, Kyle Allen. With the Commanders, it was Taylor Heineke, Sam Howell, Carson Wentz. So never had a quarterback with a PFF passing grade above 70 throughout his career. Has also been kind of restricted to that slot role for most of his career, especially in Washington, even though he's graded better when lined up out wide, has more yards per route run when lined up out wide. And I expect that to be happening more in Buffalo this year. I kind of see it as I think Keon Coleman will be the X receiver fighting for playing time with Matt Collins, potentially Marquez Valdez-Scantling in there a little bit. But then Curtis Samuel, probably the Z receiver, and Khalil Shakir in the slot. And they will move guys around a little bit here and there, but that's more or less where I view them to be most of the time. So I think Samuel will see more work outside than he's seen in a long time. He is reuniting with Joe Brady, who's the offensive coordinator in Buffalo. And when Brady was the offensive coordinator with Carolina for that 1 year Samuel was there, he had career highs in receptions, receiving yards, and I think also pretty notably rushing attempts and rushing yards. So I think the rushing aspect of things will also be pretty big for him there, because we saw the Bills run a lot more over the second half of last season. And I think it was kind of interesting looking at the receiving splits both before and after the offensive coordinator change midseason. We saw like Stephon Diggs more or less get phased out of the offense over the second half of the season. We saw a bunch of we saw all of their offensive skill players get between 220 and 370 receiving yards since the offensive coordinator changed. That's all three wide receivers, including Davis and Dalton Kincaid and James Cook. So they were really spreading the ball around. And considering how much the Bills wide receivers in general, all of them have been hyped up, and we expect big things out of Kincaid and we expect big things out of Cook. So I would not be surprised if they are spreading the ball around a lot again this season. And having that rushing production to go along with receiving, I think will be a big part of why I view Samuel higher than some of these other receivers. But it's interesting in that like all of them have very similar ADPs. So you're not even really talking about who you like better compared to ADP. You can just pick who you like better out of the group.
Yeah, that's the thing, and I do like Samuel as well, right? And like you said, his time with Joe Brady, like that, I think was encouraging as well. Like even a career high in receiving grade and yards per route run in there as well. Mostly doing from the slot, and that's the kind of part that worries me for my guy here that I really like in Buffalo, because I'm hoping that he does take a kind of stranglehold of that slot role and let Samuel play more outside, like you said. But yeah, for me, like the Bills, I think breakout candidate is Khalil Shakir. I loved watching Shakir last season. He's a really fun player. I mean, that 80-yard touchdown he had against the Jets last season was so good with Sauce Gardner in his face too, plus all that yak work. Like, how do you not fall in love with a guy seeing stuff like that? But he's definitely a deep breakout candidate for this list, I guess, considering, he's being drafted well outside the top 50 players at his position. But I think he has a decent shot here to kind of emerge as like a top target earner in this offense, which is a high-end offense with an elite quarterback as well. We saw that, once he became a regular part of Buffalo's offense in week 7 last season, he ended up finishing second on the team to only Stephon Diggs in target rate and total targets. And then from that span on, I believe including the playoffs, he also led the team in receiving yards and yards per route run and tied for the team lead in touchdowns during that span. And I think that just kind of speaks to his skill set, as well as just like a quarterback friendly target that knows how to find holes in the zone and delivers exactly what's kind of expected on him on every route. So I think he's going to be one of those guys that is hard to keep off the field, or at least that's what I'm hoping here for him to deliver on this breakout potential. And, maybe being, keeping that momentum going from being like a go-to target again is going to be a challenge, like you said, because they are going to spread the ball around a little bit more because they have such similar options. But I think there's reasons to kind of be, I guess, encouraged by him or confident about him potentially breaking out here. He's going to need some help. Obviously, we're going to need probably around a 75% or more route participation from him. I think he was around 72% once he became kind of a regular in the offense last season, but that led to 9.0 PPR points per game. And that was with contending with Stephon Diggs's volume as well. But I think there's a chance, if he's going to improve to, say, double-digit fantasy points per game this year, he'll have to kind of continue being a regular in the lineup, obviously, and, contending with those targets like Curtis Samuel, like Dalton Kincaid, Keon Coleman as well. Although I'm not a full believer that Keon Coleman's going to hit the ground running in the NFL, but it's definitely possible. And then, yeah, maybe becoming slightly more than just a slot receiver, like you said. Like, I know he's not a big receiver. He's, I think, 6 feet, 190 pounds, which is why he spends most of his time in the slot. But he's not a stranger to playing outside, and he's definitely capable of it as well. Like, he did it at Boise State. I think he spent the 2020 season playing almost entirely on the outside. He racked up 3.24 yards per route run on more than 200 routes there. And yeah, I think it, like, again, another guy that I kind of look to the college profile a little bit when we don't have a huge sample size in the NFL. And I think it is kind of encouraging that, he's more than just a 1 year wonder. Looking at that profile, and could potentially carve out a larger role this season. He left college with an 86th percentile mark in career yards per route run, 2.80 among prospects since 2019. And then, like I said, did so as more than just kind of a slot only wide receiver. He ranked in the 77th percentile in yards per route run when lined up wide at 2.61, and 81st percentile from the slot at 3.01. So he did only spend 27.3% of his snaps out wide in the NFL. So, kind of staying on the field in those different personnel packages, like you said, two wide receiver sets, it could be helpful, obviously, or I mean, will be helpful in a big way, but it's probably unlikely for him, but not an impossible task, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, just considering kind of his past history and ability as well.
Yeah, I think that two wide receiver set stuff will be interesting, since there were plenty of times in two wide receiver sets where if they wanted one of the two outside guys off the field, it was Shakir on the field in place of them. So I think he's definitely capable of playing in those two receiver sets, but I kind of expect Shakir and Samuel to be fighting for one of those spots, whereas all of the other receivers fighting for another one, since all of them having different skill sets compared to what these two guys have. And it'll be interesting also to see just how much they're using 11 personnel versus 12 personnel, since we had times last season where one of the two tight ends was injured, but now we're back to a point where Dalton Kincaid and Dawson Knox are both healthy, and how those snaps will be distributed between those two players. And if they're both on the field, then who else is on the field with them? I think that'll be important. I did get at least slightly discouraged looking at Shakir's big plays last season, because you were talking about that 80-yard one, and that's one where the cornerback tried to get the interception, missed on the interception, and that's why he was able to run so much to begin with. And he did make some nice moves after that point, but it could have very easily been pass defended. And then a couple weeks later, he had a 40-yard reception on a screenplay where it was two receivers on the side, two defenders. The other receiver did the good screen block. The other defender ran right into the screen block, so he was able to just get around the corner and sprint really fast. So when you're able to get a player in those positions and he does well, that's certainly a good thing. But he needed at least a little bit of luck to get in those positions, those two games. And I was particularly looking at it when Brady took over as offensive coordinator, and he had those two games with over 100 yards when he had those two big plays. The other games, it was 5 games under 50 yards and not getting as many targets in those games. So he did depend a bit on those two plays in order for his fantasy production to be as high as it was. But he also has gotten plenty of praise throughout training camp. And I certainly, whenever they're in 3 receiver sets, expect him to be on the field pretty much all the time. So I agree there are plenty of reasons to be excited about him, but I'm a little worried in general, like even with Samuel as well, that this will just be like which wide receiver does well this week, or does Kincaid do well this week? And then they're running a lot outside of that. But if the defense takes a step back this year because they've lost their safeties, have made some other changes on the defense, and they get into some more shootouts, then that could be huge for everyone in the offense.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's definitely, I'd say, probably the riskiest pick for me on my list here, like just kind of looking at the deeper guys. But yeah, I do have a soft spot for Shakir because I do like him quite a bit. But that's pretty much kind of our main list here that we talked, that we wanted to cover. But there were like some, I guess, borderline players, or players that we maybe weren't as confident in having like a true breakout season this year. So I think one of the names that probably stands out for people when they're looking at potential breakout wide receivers, especially considering all the offseason hype right now, is Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. So I did not put him on my list when I made the Breakout article a few weeks ago. I just, looking at his body of work during his first 2 seasons, like, it's a small sample size. We could probably work in his college profile there, but it wasn't encouraging enough for me to consider like a breakout year for him. Like I think it could definitely be an improved year, but I wasn't qualifying it as like a true breakout, especially, you know, being on a run heavy offense and having that target competition of Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, and even Jahmyr Gibbs, right? So that was all the stuff that kind of kept me from getting too excited about him. But I mean, look, the offseason noise around Jameson Williams is loud right now. So how are you feeling about the Lions wide receiver heading into year 3 for him? Are you kind of buying the hype, or are you tempering expectations for JMO in 2024?
Yeah, I think a lot of the things we were talking about with Rashid Shaheed kind of apply here, and that Williams is a big playmaker. He's made plenty of big plays in the NFL, just hasn't been consistent at doing a lot of other things, and is on a team that has less wide receiver depth than they did the year before. So that puts Williams more as a clear wide receiver 2, where Josh Reynolds was with the team before. So it was a bit more of a rotation. So I think that's all positive for him. But like you said, it's the competition for targets with the top wide receiver, but also at tight end and at running back. And they're going to be running the ball more often. And especially if they're winning games, they can run the ball all they want because that's what they enjoy doing. So I think he can definitely have a better season than what we've seen before. But he's the kind of person that I'll be happy to put him in my DFS lineup all the time. But putting him in my fantasy starting lineup, he'll probably not do much the weeks where I have him in my lineup and blow up the weeks that I have him on my bench. So that's kind of how I'm viewing him. And similar, like if you're still doing best ball drafts, much happier to get him in best ball than I am in redraft.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Like you could take a late swing on him in best ball and hope for those, you know, weeks that he has a big play that he'll pop into your lineup. But trying to figure that out, I think week to week is going to be a lot harder for redraft purposes for Jameson Williams. Another popular name, I think this offseason, as far as, you know, potential big years of breakout years, is Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. For me, I like Reed, obviously. Like I think he's going to be potentially a top wide receiver in the top wide receiver in Green Bay, but I think he's got competition, right? And I think that's the part of it that kind of concerns me for him over delivering to such a point from last year that it's considered a breakout, like 13 PPR points per game as a rookie. And then that was a lot of that without, you know, Christian Watson healthy, Luke Musgrave as well. But I just didn't want to expect too much of an improvement from Jayden Reed from last year to this year to call him a breakout. But yeah, he's another one that was kind of borderline for me. So how about you? Where are you at with Reed?
Yeah, I know I've done my Reed rant at least once on the podcast before, so I won't go through everything again. I do have his player profile going out again tomorrow, but it's the thing where I did the research at the beginning of the season of how difficult it is for a player who only plays in the slot to be a consistent fantasy starter. And we saw it last season because they had the injuries at wide receiver, they had injuries at tight end, so they stopped using as much 12 personnel. They had injuries at running back, so they started running the ball with Reed more. And now they have more depth at running back. They have their tight ends healthy. Tucker Kraft recently got off the injured list, so he should hopefully be good to go for week 1. And they have all of the wide receivers where Watson went through everything this offseason, tried to make sure that his legs were equally strong to each other so he can stop having those consistent injuries that he's been having. Dontavian Wicks has been getting plenty of praise this offseason, Romeo Doubs as well. So they have so many weapons in Green Bay that if he's only playing in 11 personnel like he was last year, since even the other backup wide receivers were playing ahead of Reed in 2 wide receiver sets last year. So I could very well see them not needing to do as much 11 personnel, which means Reed isn't on the field as much. So I think he can have a couple of big games throughout the season, but we don't know when they're going to happen. We saw games last year where they're like, okay, let's use a lot of 13 personnel. Let's use a lot of 12 personnel just because the team isn't expecting it. So that meant Reed wasn't on the field as much for those games. And not that you can take too much stock into the Packers family night, which is a practice that they do at Lambeau Field where they sell out, even though it's just a fun practice they do. I've been a couple of years to that, so it's a fun experience. But someone went through, I'm surprised someone beat me to it and did the snap counts for that game. And he only played in, I think, 16 of 26 snaps with the starters, so around 60%, which is just not enough playing time to be a consistent fantasy starter. He can still make those big plays. And another concern that I had when writing his player profile is those deep plays. He had a much higher average depth of target than you expect from a slot receiver because they had a lot of big plays to him. But that's also something that Christian Watson is very good at. So if Watson is going back to taking some of those deeper targets, then Reed might not be getting as many deep targets, which those big plays are huge for your fantasy production because you're getting a ton of yards, hopefully getting a touchdown to go along with it. So I'm just very concerned about him, but a similar thing where, like, if it's a best ball draft, if it's DFS, he could have 100+ yards and a touchdown any given week, but I just don't think it'll be the most common thing for him to put up fantasy starting production.
Yep. No, makes perfect sense. Any other names that were kind of borderline for you that, people might consider breakout potential or that you weren't really buying? I mean, I've seen Tank Dell as a breakout candidate, but I don't really believe, he was already averaging 16.5 PPR points per game across his 10 full appearances last year. I don't think we can ask for much more than that, especially with the added target competition in year 2. I don't know. I mean, the New England wide receivers are that I considered Demario Douglas, but I'm just like, they're all the same. Like, they're the same picture. When I'm looking at all these guys, they could all do the exact same thing. So I don't know, that there wasn't really anybody else that kind of stood out for me as a potential breakout wide receiver. I don't know if you felt the same.
Yeah, like we looked at guys who haven't been either top 12 receivers or high wide receiver twos. I took that to be top 15 receivers. Yep. Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave fit the definition, but it's like they're we regard them highly anyway. I like them right around their ADP. So for me, that's similar. There's guys like Zay Flowers where I expect him to do a little bit better than last season, but I just don't see the path for him having a huge season. We haven't gotten the Brandon Ayuk trade yet, but maybe it'll happen and that'll have a big impact on George Pickens. But the fact that they want Ayuk so much probably isn't the best sign for Pickens out there. I think probably the interesting names for me are like some of the veterans that you can draft highly that just haven't done it yet. Hollywood Brown, Cortland Sutton, and Samuel's the other one that all fit the description, but like everyone else is either a second year or third year wide receiver where like, it makes a ton of sense that you expect someone who was a first or second round draft pick to get better in their second and third year. But some of the veterans, excited about Hollywood Brown, probably a little less excited about Cortland Sutton, but I didn't include Hollywood Brown just because then I'd have 2 Kansas City Chiefs wide receivers to talk about. And it's hard to see both of them doing well, but it's certainly possible since the Chiefs offense just didn't do as well last year. And he adds a deep threat element that they didn't have in the offense last year. So I think Brown could have a huge season as well as Rice, even with them both on the field, since we've seen plenty of teams that have 2 good wide receivers both do really well for fantasy.
Yeah, I'm with you. I like the fit for Marquise Brown in Kansas City. That was when we were doing like pre-free agency favorite fits, and Marquise Brown to Kansas City was my pick, and I kind of went over it then. But you could probably go back and listen to it. It'd still be relevant if you want to hear the full spiel. But yeah, there's definitely some guys that could fit the list. But I like where we're at with our guys. So that's gonna do it for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Let us know your breakout wide receiver picks in the comments on the YouTube, and don't forget to like and subscribe while you're there. We'd very much appreciate that. Nate, big thanks to you as well for going through all these breakout wide receivers with me and dropping knowledge on the good people. And for those that want more, let them know what else you have going on at pff.com this week.
So a lot of the usual stuff, have at least 3 player profiles going up every day. We'll have the fantasy football recaps to the preseason games coming up on these next few days now that we have preseason, so very excited about that. I've been going through breakouts and draft strategy, updating position rankings. Something that I have been excited about the last few days is some articles that I had hoped to write last year but didn't get the time to. I got kicker rankings and defense ranking articles, the most I've written about kickers and defense in probably the last 2 years. And then also today we had offensive line rankings, so looking at what the offensive line means for running backs and wide receivers in fantasy football. how much of an impact they have, how much that should influence your rankings or decisions on players, and then the full rankings, as well as some of the teams that had the biggest changes from last season to this season. So who you can expect to have better or worse seasons this year because of it.
Nice. Love that. Yeah. As for me, I've written up my favorite ADP targets at running back and wide receiver that'll be on the site by tomorrow. While also in the process of updating my offseason rankings and tiers. So that's quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. And for the IDP crowd, it's defensive line, linebacker, defensive back as well. And Dynasty IDP rankings that'll be updated to version 3.0 here shortly. I also recorded 2 YouTube exclusive mini videos for the channel covering my 3 favorite dark horse RB1 candidates and 3 favorite dark horse wide receiver 1 candidates for this season. So if you're an audio only listener of the pod and want to check out those like 12-ish minute videos, you could head on over to the YouTube and check them out. And again, we always appreciate a like and subscribe there as well. I'll be back on Friday talking IDP fades with the great Tom Kislingberry. Nate and I will be back same time next week as well. So until then, peace out.